Going to do some, well, let me talk about where we are in the class. I think except for a few of you, I've gotten all of the midterms final grades, number grades posted in Blackboard. You can check the essay questions. If there's points taken off, I typically would leave a comment. A lot of you may have left out. If I took points off, I was pretty gracious generally, and the big things that I was looking for that I was feisty and took points off for. If you didn't mention the promised seed of Genesis 3:15, I may have taken off a point or two. A lot of you, we talked a lot about faith and Abraham's example of faith that comes out of Genesis, and so much so that the writers of the New Testament use him as an example of faith. So I was hopeful that a lot of you did. Some of you didn't, so I maybe took off some points for that. But the basic elements of the gospel, you can talk about the image of God, you can talk about sin, and a lot of you did that in Genesis 2, and Genesis 3, the promised seed. You can talk about Abraham's faith example, and Genesis 15, it was credited to him as righteousness. What happened there, the transaction. And those are all the elements of the gospel that I was looking for. So, but a lot of you did really well. I was really encouraged with the test. And so what we're going to do is just talk about numbers today. I'm intentionally choosing to remain slightly off of where we are in this syllabus. The reason is I think I'm going to adjust our lecture topics to maybe move at least one of our lectures to the spring semester. So I'm going to probably choose intentionally to cover less content this semester and spend a little more time. I call them the scenic overlooks. I like to show you a little bit of my exploration in some of the books, namely Deuteronomy. I love Deuteronomy. So I want to make sure we have enough time there to cover that so that you can have a good confidence. You have some confidence to deal with a book like that and make it come alive for your people and your congregations, your Sunday school classes and youth groups and all the people that you influence. So that's what we're going to do. Stay with the reading schedule according to the syllabi. So that third column, all of those titles refer to a chapter in our textbook. Go ahead and stay with that as we finish out the semester. So yes, there will be a reading quiz each week from here until the end. I guess we end on week 14 or whatever. So, and the group discussions. Just as a way of reminder, I've got posted now 3 extra credit opportunities. So that's kind of cool. If I was a student in my class, I'd like that. Especially if you didn't think you did as well as you wanted to on the midterm. And if you were a student like me, you'd always take advantage of the extra credit. And one of them's involving a campus activity that we have a guy coming to do that presentation on the Galilee boat. It's kind of interesting. And so you can participate in that, and that's something that you can do for extra credit. Let's see. Any questions on anything that I just said? Pretty clear, so we can keep going here. All right, let's talk about the book of Numbers. So, all right. Well, the book of Numbers is going to introduce us to part of the ongoing problem and the difficulty with where Israel is at in terms of this generation that's come out of Egypt. It's going to focus on 2 generations, actually. Thus the title of the book, Numbers, which refers to the fact that in the book there's 2 censuses taken. You probably knew that. So the censuses refer to 2 different generations of Israel. Generation 1, post-Exodus, or out of Egypt generation, and then you've got the post-wilderness wandering generation. 40 years plus later, this new generation emerges, and that's the generation that ends the book, lands on the plains of Moab, and ends up poised and ready for taking the promised land. So it's kind of a focus on these generations, and there's some rich theology that comes out of this book in a lot of interesting places that most people don't even care to maybe bother to slow down and read carefully and look. But I want to highlight some of those places for you, and it helps us to understand the difficulty and conflict in this book. The problem does not lie with God and His plan. The problem is always with the people. And this is what we're going to find out. So this is a generation that emerges. This first generation is best known as a generation that tests the Lord. This idea of testing is never a good thing when an individual or a group of people test God. That's the antithesis of what we hope for and what we look for in the biblical context. God is about testing us. We'll talk more about testing here in a little bit. But we'll find that this first generation is a generation that's in dire and desperate need of refinement. They're not where they need to be. And like what we've seen before with some other examples of testing, namely the brothers of Joseph. Remember that we talked about testing in that context, in the patriarchal context. Now Israel's emerged as a group of brothers, and they need to be refined. They need to be tested as well. And we'll find that the wilderness experience is exactly the mechanism by which God tests and refines Israel. So we'll talk more about that when we get there. All right? All right, there we go. So, we've got a lot of traveling. It's hard to keep track of the movement that happens in the book of Numbers. But we've got various stages coming out of Egypt to Mount Sinai. We've already covered that ground. They were at Mount Sinai for 2 months. And the biblical text that covers this period is approximately Exodus 13 and the entire book of Leviticus. We moved from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, and I'll show you that on a map here in just a minute. Numbers 1 through 12, chapters 1 through 12. And then we have the difficulty, the fork in the road, as we'll see. They're going to be in the wilderness 40 years. But we just got about 7 chapters that cover that wilderness experience, which is interesting. But, there's a lot of time, but not a lot of airplay with regards to the text. And then we have the wilderness to the plains of Moab, Numbers 20 through 21. And then finally we transition to the last book of the Pentateuch, on the plains of Moab, for the entire context of the book of Deuteronomy. So this is a lot of time. I call this Israel's classroom experience. Every lesson is pretty much like the day before. Class time got a little boring at times, I'm sure. But it was a time of struggle, as we'll see. There were people who died in the wilderness every day, perhaps. And there was a struggle and challenges along the way. But that's what refining is. That's the difficulty of life that sometimes we see people go through. And we'll talk about the theology of testing. Here's our deep thought picture. We stop and we ponder the book of Numbers. That's the big idea, is obviously the wandering in the wilderness, right? In the wilderness. All right. So that's our deep thought picture. Well, let's talk about how the book can be structured or organized. There's kind of a couple different approaches. We've seen how the structure and organization sometimes is important. We saw the treaty form that shows up like in the book of Deuteronomy. So there's 2 approaches. You can look at the geography of the book of Numbers, or you can look at the focus on the 2 generations and how the book can be organized. So we've got the first approach, the geography. You can see Numbers 1 through 12. And this is basically the geography, or from this place to this place. Wandering, you've got Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, wandering in the wilderness, and wilderness to Moab. and then plains of Moab. So that's one approach, and that gives you 3 major sections within the book of Numbers, and then we get to the book of Deuteronomy. Or you can just focus on the generations, and the separator there is the census, the 2 censuses that are taken. So the focus on the first generation, the first 25 chapters, and then the last part on the wilderness generation, Numbers 26 through 36. So that's basically the part. This generation here, a lot of the information there focuses on their failure at a place called Kadesh Barnea. And then the second part, the second generation, will be kind of revving up to getting them ready for the promised land. So that's going to be the theological focus on each of these chapters. So let's talk first. One of the things that is kind of interesting is and I'll spend a little time, and I know your textbook does focus on this, so I just wanted to bring in a little bit of the discussion from my own vantage point, is numbers of numbers. Now, like I've said before, this is not an issue to break a church up over. It's an interpretive discussion. And Hebrew words, we get into the meaning of the Hebrew words at this point. So we look at certain terms that describe the quantity of the number of Israelites that were coming out of Egypt, and we try to figure that out and sort that all out. I've gotten into a couple conversations, maybe not with anybody in this room, but sometimes students will talk about the literal translation, the literal reading or whatever of God's Word. And what I hear when that student talks about it that way is that they've been told that there's only one right interpretation of a particular section of text or a particular word that comes out of the text. And that's the literal reading of that particular verse. And there's only one right way to read that verse. And the thing that I gently explain is that sometimes behind the scenes, underneath the level of English, I remind students that there's Hebrew. And a literal reading of the English is not the same thing as understanding what the Hebrew is saying. And when you get into the big leagues, which you are, you're going to be learning languages. Some of you are learning Hebrew now. And you understand that there's a semantic range, and we get into interpretation and hermeneutics and all of those things. And that's the challenge. So when you read an English, when you read your English Bible, and you read an English translation and start talking about a literal interpretation, you're at the mercy of the translation committee who came up with that translation. They're the ones who came together and said, oh, we're going to go this way or we're going to go this way, and this is the way we go. So they get together, have coffee, talk about it, and the New American Standard Translation, they go with this particular translation. But this is an interesting question. So again, what I'm talking about is not a issue to break a church up over. There's no salvation issues. There's nothing that changes the gospel. This is just trying to understand historically what was going on. And we get into this issue of the numbers. Apologetically, you may have people in your congregation that struggle with the idea that 1.5 million Israelites come out of Egypt, or 2 million. Maybe they've heard a number bigger than that. And they struggle with that so much so that it affects their willingness to embrace the gospel, to respond to Christ. And then I read that Old Testament, I just can't believe that that's true. Now, I throw this out. This discussion that we're moving ahead in is just something that you need to have in your back pocket. And you might need to wrestle with a little bit yourself so that you can help people understand these things. The Bible's not, and this is not to take away the miraculous provision of God being with His people, providing for them manna, quail, water, winning battles for them along the way, and all of those things that happened miraculously out of Egypt. Whether you talk about this many Israelites or slightly less many Israelites, it's not going to change the theological emphasis of what happens. God's with His people, He's leading them, He's providing for them, and He's getting them to the promised land. So this is just one of those, things that sometimes people hold very strongly. So the census, the numbers in chapter 1 and chapter 26, at face value, you might say, presents 600,000 men of fighting age. That's how that number, that initial number is presented. 600,000 men of fighting age. So that's what we're looking at in the, at least in the interpretation. But we look, and this chart here talks about the two columns here represent generation number 1, post-wilderness generation. Based on the tribes and the tribal allotments, what's interesting is that the total number, that's where we get that 600 plus or minus thousand of the numbered fighting men. That's what the numbers that typically will show up in our English translations. There's not a big difference coming out of the wilderness. So this is just shows you that a generation wanes and then comes out, and we end up pretty much where we started, post-wilderness generation. And so Numbers chapter 1 and Numbers chapter 26. So let me talk to you now about how to look at this and these numbers. If we look at the 625,000, I'm just going to round it to 625,000. Some of the critics, or some of the discussion focuses on, that's just fighting men. So if you factor in, you know, wives, spouses, children, and everybody else that's traveling along with each one of those numbered males, that's where you get the number of 1.5 to somewhere upwards of 2.5 million children, if we include, 1.5 to 2.5 million individuals if children and women are also numbered and included. So this raises a question. Here, I'm going to fix this. This is kind of bothering me, sorry. There we go. So the question is raised, how could this large group, and I've heard this before, maybe you have too, how could this large of a group have been provided for in the wilderness? A lot of people. This is a population, this population of Israel would have been more than double the population of Israel during the time of the high point of King David, in terms of the total number of Israelites in the kingdom. Bigger. According to Deuteronomy 7:7, Israel was supposed to be the smallest of the nations. I mean, just a little guy in terms of population. So 1.5 million, if we go with the more conservative number, doesn't line up exactly well with that idea out of Deuteronomy, as well as other populations of cities and nations that were around during that time period. The population of Palestine as a whole during that time was about 200,000. So if Israel was that large, the primary theological thrust in the wilderness would have been a supremely emphatic death march. This is what it sounds like. Israel's camp would have been a walking mortuary, which there was death in the wilderness, but how much? Male funerals would have been at that high rate of 1.5 to 2.5 million. About 41 people a day would have been dying, based on getting from here to getting from here to here. So that's a lot of death, and it raises the question about if we include, just on the numbered males, now if we include women and children, that number of 41 a day would have been maybe upwards of 100. So the dominant theological theme, we see that the real theological focus on the census and the intention was in numbering the soldiers with a future view of the fact that we've got to get our army ready. That's the big idea of the census. That's why Moses was calling for the census. Let's organize ourselves, let's get ourselves ready for our first battle should we have a skirmish along the way. So now there's different views that scholars like to talk about these things, and there's been a lot of discussion on this. So where some scholars go, there's the literal and historic. In other words, this is the reality: 1.5 to 2.5 million Israelites. That's the first position. How all of this happened miraculously in the wilderness, we've got some things to go on in the text, but more information is on the way. We've got the non-literal and non-historical approach. So some scholars have gone into the area of talking about this focuses on the miraculous provision and protection of God, but it's just a literary device. We're not really talking about real history here. We've heard this before. Don't take the Bible seriously when it comes to history. It's an exaggeration. The author was getting a little bit, jumpy with regards to his numbers. It's just exaggerating, things like that. All right? And then there's a middle position. There's a middle position. I'm interested in the middle positions. Literal history, but a real close attention to what the text is saying. So let's take a look at this middle position a little bit. And this is the one that I probably, just to let you know, I'm a little bit closer to because of my background with the Boy Scouts. All right? So here's the same chart that we had before. So here's the middle position. It involves an interpretation of the Hebrew, for those of you learning Hebrew numbers, this is a good old-fashioned seglet down. It's a number that means 1,000. 1,000, 3 zeros. But as sometimes Hebrew words go, there's a semantic range of meaning. So there's more than one option to go on. This word means 1,000, Aleph, that's how we say that word. But it also can mean this. Clan, or in the military sense, or in the Boy Scout sense, troop. Alright? So here's how this works. So the 1,000, instead of interpreting it as 1,000 in a numerical sense, in the text that describes these numbers in the census, if we go with the idea of troop, here's what this chart looks like. Alright? Here's how it reads. Instead of, like, for example, if we take Reuben, the tribe of Reuben, you see 46,000. And in English translation, you have 46,500 as the total number. But if Aleph means troop, you've got the number of troops, 46, and then you've got, with 500 men, or 500, let me see, I'm saying this wrong. You have 46 troops or patrols. The idea in Boy Scouts, I like to talk about the patrol leaders, for a total of 500 men within that troop, 11 men per group. So 46 troops for a total of 500 men. That's what I was trying to say. Instead of 46,500. So you can see that the 1,000 is taken away, and that just refers to the total of 500. So 46 troops with 500 in each troop. Or 500 soldiers. So the tribe of Reuben is contributing 500 soldiers at the proper range of age. That would be the quality of how they would define a fighting soldier. So each of the tribes is contributing 500 soldiers, 300 soldiers, 650, all the way down through Naphtali, 400. For a total of 5,550 fighting men. In terms of the census in this particular case being used to organize Israel in terms of fighting troops. That's what we're looking at with this particular translation of Hebrew term Aleph. So instead of 600,000 fighting men, Israel's army consisted of 5,550. All right? So we keep going here. And that's like the Boy Scouts, the organization, tight control, and there's the census going on. So they're getting themselves prepared and ready for whatever their near future holds. They know they're going to have to be fighting battles, so they're getting themselves organized in terms of how they're going to fight, how they're going to organize themselves on the battlefield, and things like that. So the first registration, the first census, yields 5,550 soldiers. After 40 years, that slightly increases to 5,730 soldiers. So if we do the math like we did before, we're going to end up, if we include, based on the number of fighting men, women, and children, we're going to have about 72,000 Israelites, given about maybe 13 members under each household by average in terms of children and women and perhaps some servants along the way. So that's a huge contrast in terms of 1.5 million. But again, like I said, this particular approach and interpretation doesn't diminish at all the theological thrust of the miraculous provision, God's being with His people, providing manna, quail, water, winning the battles for them, because they aren't the biggest now. They aren't the biggest army around. Yes, there's going to be death in the camp. People will die in the wilderness, and there will be a generation that, in a sense, is left behind in the wilderness as everything moves ahead. So I don't take away any of some of that refining that's going on. This is a generation that needs to be refined in the wilderness. Generation 1, they're not ready to take the land, as we'll see. We have to wait for another generation to emerge, and that's the generation that we'll have with the second census. All right, again, but this isn't an issue to break a church up over. It just might help us to understand maybe there's a more, and this number fits better within the context of the known ancient world at that time, with regards to populations and the size of some of the archaeological, what we estimate to be the size of the cities around and all of that. So there you go.
Dr. Smith, in what setting would you talk about this? Would you ever bring this up? Like if you say you're preaching a sermon on numbers or Exodus, you would never bring it up?
No, probably not, because unless it's a trouble spot I'd bring it up in a Sunday school class. Perhaps if your people are wondering, I mean, have you ever heard some people struggle with a large number? Like, that's just, it's inconceivable how that many people could be coming out. Is it too big of a number for some people? Maybe not. If it is a struggle, I'm just throwing this out as an option, something to consider. So that's why we come to seminary, to try to understand. And it's all based on the meaning of this Hebrew word. So it's a textual approach. We're trying to stay close to what we think the author is saying. Yeah. What he's. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Yeah, in a sermon, I would. This is so much so that there's so many more things you can say if you're preaching this and helping your congregation, preaching through this text. I probably would focus just on what God is doing and providing for His people. This census is taken as a means of getting ready for the battle that's coming. It's a counting of fighting soldiers. They're organizing themselves for the camp, getting ready for the what next, and that kind of a thing. All right, let's move ahead here. Here's something that we have archaeologically, and I just throw this in for some of you who will go into archaeology as a potential area of focus down the road, perhaps. So let's take a look at Numbers chapter 6. And we talk about the like in textual criticism, we talk about the oldest surviving Hebrew texts that we have, and the oldest ones that we have are from the collection of, we hear a lot about it on this campus, the Qumran scrolls, dating back to about 300 BC. But here's an example of the very oldest that we have. And it comes from this, it's called the Silver Scroll Amulet. And it dates back to about 650 BC. And it contains a portion of the priestly blessing of Numbers chapter 6. And let's take a look at that text. Numbers chapter 6, starting in verse 22. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, Thus you shall bless the sons of Israel. You shall say to them. And I almost want to sing. You know, we sang this song to our kids growing up when they were small. The Lord bless you and keep you. You know that song? The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift his countenance on you and give you peace, or shalom. So they shall invoke my name on the sons of Israel, and I will bless them. So on this very, very old, they had to unroll this scroll, this little amulet. It's actually very small. It would have been wrapped up and kept in some kind of a little container that would have been on the person as they were interacting, and they could pull it out and read from it. So they actually unraveled it, and there it was, a portion of this particular blessing. So it's a portion of, and it predates the 300 BC Qumran text by about 400 years. So it's the oldest biblical text that we have.
So I don't know where they put the word amulets. I don't know where they put the word crossword.
I'm sorry?
I said, I'm still surprised why they put that word amulet.
That just describes what it is. It's this amulet scroll, so that describes a small, rolled up piece of paper. That's what the term means, amulet. Okay? Okay, here we go. Let's move over to, we're going to take a few scenic overlooks here in just a little bit. I want to cover a few things here in the beginning. Chapter 9. Let's take a look at chapter 9. So Numbers chapter 9, beginning in verse 15. So we're still en route to Kadesh Barnea. We're coming through the wilderness. We've come out of Egypt. We're en route to Kadesh Barnea. And here I just wanted to focus on the tabernacle. We know that the tabernacle is part of the camp. It's a mobile place, and it's, you know, the whole camp is going to be structured with the tabernacle central to the Israelite camp. And it's going to, let's take a look at chapter 9. I'm going to have, is Raymond here? Raymond Jackson? Let's see. Dallas Smith. There you go. There you go. Okay. Read for us verse 15 through 23.
Now on the day that the tabernacle was erected, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and in the evening it was like the appearance of fire over the tabernacle until morning. So it was continuously, the cloud would cover it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud was lifted from over the tent, afterward the sons of Israel would set out. And in the place where the cloud settled down, there the sons of Israel would camp. At the command of the Lord, the sons of Israel would set out, and at the command of the Lord, they would camp. As long as the cloud settled over the tabernacle, they remained camped. Even when the cloud lingered over the tabernacle for many days, the sons of Israel would keep the Lord's charge and not set out. If sometimes the cloud remained a few days over the tabernacle, according to the commandment or the command of the Lord, they remained camped. Then, according to the command of the Lord, they set out. If sometimes the cloud remained from evening until morning, when the cloud was lifted in the morning, they would move out. Or if it remained in the daytime and at night, whenever the cloud was lifted, they would set out. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a year that the cloud lingered over the tabernacle, staying above it, the sons of Israel remained camped and set out, and did not set out. But when it was lifted, they did set out. At the command of the Lord they camped, and at the command of the Lord they set out. They kept the Lord's charge according to the command of the Lord through Moses.
That's good. Yeah, some interesting detail there, isn't there? Pretty much you get the idea. When the cloud was there, Israel stayed. When the cloud lifted, they're ready to move to the next place. So there's an emphasis here on the Lord's presence in terms of His guidance. His presence is in the camp, with the people. He's leading them. exactly where they need to go. And this will be continuing and true from this point on until they get to Moab and the plains of Moab. And there's some interesting detail in the next little section in chapter 10. Let's look at verses 1 through 10. Let's see here. Cody Webb, can I have you read, please?
The Lord said to Moses, "Make 2 trumpets of hammered silver and use them for calling the community together and for having the camp set out. When both are sounded, the whole community is to assemble before you at the entrance to the tent of meeting. If only one is sounded, the leaders, the heads of the clans of Israel, are to assemble before you. When a trumpet blast is sounded, the tribes camping on the east are to set out. At the sounding of a second blast, the camps on the south are to set out. The blast will be the signal for setting out. To gather the assembly, blow the trumpets, but not with the signal for setting out. The sons of Aaron, the priests, are to blow the trumpets. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you and the generations to come. When you go into battle in your own land against the enemy who is oppressing you, sound a blast on the trumpets. Then you will be remembered by the Lord your God and rescued from your enemies. Also, at your time of rejoicing, your appointed festivals and new moon feasts, you are to sound the trumpets over your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, and they will be a memorial for you before your God. I am the Lord your God."
Yeah, so I love the use of trumpets. You know my band geekiness. I've shown you some trumpets before. When we talked about, does this bring any echoes back with regards to the significance of trumpets? You know, if we're talking about the cloud and the very presence of God, right? When was the first time, you remember? Do you remember when God's presence was announced by trumpets?
Sinai?
Yeah, Mount Sinai, exactly. So if we go back there, you don't have to turn there, but Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder, or voices. So that's the idea. And the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. The Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain. Moses went up. The presence of the Lord is announced by trumpets. And so you see there at the end, not only is it the alarm call, the alarm clock going off in case there's danger or a battle that needs to be, the troops all need to be assembled and ready for defending. But you see there in verse 10, you remember we talked about the last lecture in Leviticus, we talked about those feasts and festivals were all centered and focused on experiencing the presence of the Lord, His provision, His bounty. The aliens and strangers were also invited, right? Everybody, the whole community was participating in the celebration, the feast, largely centered around and this is where the conflict comes later, the agricultural cycle. So the Lord was providing for will be providing for His people. When they get to the land and they start planting crops, the bounty of the crops will be the reason for the cycle of these feasts and festivals. At planting, at harvest. Blow the trumpets, get together. Let's remind ourselves again, who's behind this? Who's responsible for this bounty and this provision? Now, what's going to be the big threat when Israel gets to Canaan, the promised land, and there's some unconquered nations around? Guess who they're worshiping, and guess who they're giving thanks for their so-called bounty? You already know his name, right? Baal. Yeah, he's the fertility god. Fertility not just because of the sexual idea of fertility. Fertility as it's applied to the land. The fertility of land, the seeds that, they didn't maybe know all of the details that we do about how seeds grow, but they do know that when they get into the soil, something magical happens, and those plants start to come up at the appropriate time. Who do we thank for that? Baal. So there's going to be this lure of replacing God and giving Him credit for the bounty, for the fertility, in a sense, and substituting and saying, well, at first it was like this, probably, this syncretistic idea. Well, if we really want to get a double blessing, let's focus on both. 2 for the price of 1. Let's focus on Yahweh and thank Him for the bounty, and we'll also include what these Canaanites do. I mean, look at them. They've got some good crops over there too. So let's thank their God as well. You know, let's bring Baal into our discussion as well. And what we'll find is, eventually, and I might focus on this a little bit later, when we get to the prophets, they're going to raise this issue with Israel. You know, they're going to call Israel out like a courtroom lawyer and remind them of who they should be thanking for the bounty and who they've replaced Yahweh with. They end up forgetting the Lord. So this whole slow fade, and this is where it goes eventually. So, well, let's take a look. We've got some problems in the immediate context just around the corner. And kind of a center of gravity for the whole book in terms of focusing on Generation 1 is chapter 11 through 14. And so that's what I want to focus on a little bit more in some of the theology that comes out in focusing on these generations. It's really interesting that, you know, if you think about writing a history, you know, what helps me to see the realistic picture of the Bible is that they continue, the author, here again we're still focusing on Moses, continuing to focus on warts and all. It starts with the patriarchs. Abraham's the example of faith, but he's presented warts and all, you know. There's nothing, the negativity is not kind of pushed to the side. Abraham's not elevated as this sinlessly perfect king, you know, to be boasted about, and, you know, his exploits, you know, exaggerated, which oftentimes happened with how those who are recording history oftentimes exaggerate the positive qualities of whoever it is they're writing about. He was victorious. He defeated this enemy. But here we're going to have, which is interesting, this realistic history portrayed, warts and all, with regards to the wilderness generation. Let's take a look at the very first part of it in chapter 11 in the book of Numbers. So let's look there. Focus on a few places where the murmuring theme, this murmuring idea, this complaining idea starts to show up. And I really think in this early stage in Israel's history, you've got a lot of hand-holding that's going on, which, you know, we want this kid to grow up and be able to operate somewhat independently, but not only just hand-holding, we've got a lot of, you know, pulling in this early stage. Israel's a lot like a small child. And in chapter 11, let's take a look at the first 9 verses. Let's see, Tim Stone, I think I saw you over here. Could you read verses 1 through 9, chapter 11?
Now the people became like those who complain of adversary and the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard of it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned against them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed that to the Lord, and the fire died out. So the name of the place was called Terah, because the fire of the Lord burned against them. The rabble of who were among them had greedily desired us. And also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks of the onions and the garlic. But now our appetite is gone, and there is nothing at all to look at except this manna. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like bedouin. And the people would go about and gather it and grind it, and between 2 millstones, and beat it in mortar, and boil it in the pots, and make cakes with it. And the taste was like taste of cakes baked with oil. And when the dew fell on the camp at night, and manna would fall out.
So on one hand, you've got the provision of the Lord through the manna, but then you've got the people complaining about it. That's just like a small child, not recognizing and realizing the provision coming from in this case, the parent. And so this is complaining from the people. And you've got the anger of the Lord. His nose catches fire, literally, in verse 1. That's how the idea of anger is oftentimes communicated. And then we have not just the people, complaining and whining. Now everybody starts crying in a way. Let's look at verse 10. Moses is going to have a response to this situation. This is really an interesting passage in terms of recognizing the struggle of leadership or something like that. If you're giving a sermon or a Sunday school lesson to really bring out what happened in this little, this little portion or pericope, we say, this section of text, as it focuses on Moses struggling as a real person we can identify with, and what the Lord does to respond to his situation in terms of leadership is really interesting. So let's look at it. Verse 10, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. Have you ever been there? Yeah, people sometimes are hard to work with. We heard that in a sermon last week. So Moses said to the Lord in a chapel message last week, "Why hast thou been so hard on thy servant? And why have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou hast laid the burden of all this people on me?" Isn't that great? It just encapsulates the difficulty sometimes of ministry. When I when I left Lafayette, Indiana, because I was fired from ministry, that was, if I told you that, I think I told you that story of when I had to go home and tell my wife that I had to resign from my church post as a youth pastor just a couple weeks from her giving birth to our first son. Yeah, that was really fun. Not knowing where I was going to go. I lived with my parents for a while, talk about humility, and kind of licking my wounds and getting ready for the what next. I felt like God hadn't called me out of ministry. And I got the call and went over to Archibald, Ohio. And what I didn't know then was there was a guy in the youth group who at the time was just a freshman. And his name was Nate. And Nate had told everybody in the youth group, all of the other kids, that he was vowing and promising that the next youth pastor that would come in, he would drive out of town, drive out of Dodge in less than a year. And that was his goal, that was his mission in life. Everybody knew it. Nate just had, everybody kind of was like, really appreciated some of the other leaders, the previous leader, they all loved, and I can't remember why he left, but I was the new guy coming in, and Nate, he had a vendetta against me, even though he had never met me before. And Nate was the guy early on that was always the one who would on the ski trips that we took up to over to Michigan, some of those ski places up there in the Midwest, he'd smuggle in the booze. He would be the one that sometimes he'd get caught. His parents were leaders in the church. His father was one of the elders of the church. It was not a Southern Baptist church that I was going to, Evangelical Mennonite church. One trip to the Dominican Republic, it was a mission trip, he tried to smuggle back one of those souvenir machetes in his luggage. He detained the group because we almost didn't get him through because he was in such trouble. Back in those days before, can you imagine now what that would do? I mean, he'd be, So this was the thing, and he was always talking negatively about me, about Ellen. It was just hard. Have you ever been in a situation like that? You can't. I went into the pastor. I'll just go a few more minutes and we can take our break. This is just a fun story. After a Friday night football game, he was a football player, and after the game, he'd get his buddies together. Now, I lived out away from the main city, this small little farming community, out in the middle of a few cornfields and some soybean fields. My house was all by itself on the one road that goes out of the north part of town. And all of a sudden, I woke up some Saturday morning after Friday night home games. It was always after Friday night home games that my mailbox had been destroyed. Right? The kids that would just go around and, you take a baseball bat and you destroy a mailbox. Some of you probably were involved in that yourself, so the altar's open. So I went to Home Depot and got one of those replacement mailboxes. I just wasn't sure what happened. Maybe somebody accidentally backed up into it or something. I didn't know, what had happened, but I had to replace it because the postman came to my door and said, "Hey, your mailbox has been destroyed. I can't deliver your mail." So I was like, "Okay," I'm going to Home Depot. Got one of those uni-molded plastic styles. You've probably seen them before. You just get a nice big wood, 2x2, stick it in, concrete it, and slide that thing right over the top of it. That's going to be great and sturdy and all of that. Next week, 1 week later, 7 days later, on a Saturday morning, I woke up, went out to get the newspaper, and noticed that plastic, uniframe plastic Home Depot special had been absolutely destroyed and smashed. I mean, it was like crazy. So I was like upset, and rumors started to fly. And I had some loyal youth group members in the youth group, and word got out that it was Nate and his groupies. Nate and his his posse, going around smashing my mailbox and thinking that was really funny. So I said, I'm going to do that. I'm just going to figure out some way that he will never do this again. So I went to Home Depot and got one of those big metal, oversized mailboxes. And it was like that big, all right? And I got a coffee can, put it inside, got a bag of concrete, and poured concrete around the outside of it so that it was concreted in with a small hole for the mail. So that if you open the door, you'd see a wall of concrete with a small little round opening to put the mail in. And I set that and bolted that to a 4x4 wood post, concreted that into the ground. All right? I spent a whole afternoon on this, trust me. I said, that's the indestructible mailbox. So a week later, I get up on Saturday morning. I was actually excited because I thought, I'm going to see my mailbox intact. When I opened the door, I looked at the back side of my mailbox, and I'll just draw a picture of it with my oversized black pen here. Here's what the mailbox looked like from the back side. He had taken an oversized M80 firecracker, put it, or maybe several, put it in the mailbox, blew a hole out of the back. Through the metal, there was an open gash with shrapnel kind of draping down. He had exploded my mailbox. So, church was a little hard the next day. And, it was hard looking anybody in the eye. Because everybody kind of rumors, in a small town, everybody knew, oh, poor Pastor Smith, and his mailbox situation. Happened again, I heard, And I went into the pastor. And the next day on Monday, and I said, Matt, you got to help me on this. I mean, what am I supposed to do? This keeps going on, and, I want to wring this guy's neck. And it was like, I don't know what to do. You're on your own. You didn't have my back, and it was kind of disheartening, but I felt like this picture really did. And so, to make a long story short, from that location, that particular ministry post is when God kind of redirected me going back to school. So we left there on great terms. Nate had his senior year, which he was kind of happy about, but that was the year that we moved to Southern Indiana to go to school. Well, we were down at school, and I moved to New Albany, and I was, I was working on my MDiv, and the phone rang. And this was probably 3 years later. The phone rang. In the middle, I was probably studying church history or something, and my wife answered the phone, and she said, "It's Nate." "You remember Nate?" I said, "Yeah, I remember Nate." Nate's calling me. And he gets on the phone, and he said, Mr. Smith, I know, he says, I was really hard on you when you were there as our pastor and youth pastor, and I just wanted to say that God got a hold of my heart, and the year after you left, and I realize now that I was wrong, and I shouldn't have done that, and I'm calling you to ask you for your forgiveness. Yeah, and I hung up the phone. No, I'm just kidding. I said, Nate, that's wonderful. What are you doing now with your life? And he said, I'm at a Bible college in Minnesota preparing to be a pastor. Can you believe that? Yeah. So just know that you're going to have the Nates. You're going to have the Nates, whether you're a youth pastor or working with the church. And you stay true to your calling and don't lose sight of, you're in the forest, don't, focus on the trees. You're in a forest and, God is with you and He's moving you to where He needs you to go. And you're going to have difficult people along the way. And you just need to trust the Lord. He's the one working behind the scenes. He's your pillar of cloud by day and your fire by night. And you'll navigate through these difficult situations. God will work out His end. He'll change hearts. He'll change lives. So they always say sometimes the most difficult kids in youth ministry end up being called to ministry down the road. Maybe you've seen that true in your own life. Maybe that's part of your testimony. So, all right, let's take our first break. We'll come back in about 5 minutes. All right.